In 1637, a Dutch carpenter traded his house for a single striped tulip bulb, certain he had just made the smartest deal of his life. He was not a fool. He was reacting the same way millions of people have reacted since, to a market that had convinced an entire city a price could only climb. The tulip did not invent that feeling. It only proved, for one strange season, exactly how far a market could carry it. This hour is about where that machine actually came from. The clerks, the coffee houses, the trees, the panics, and the plain paper promises that grew, slowly and almost by accident, into something the world now calls the stock market. None of what follows is a suggestion about what to buy, sell, or do with your own money. It is simply an account of what people have already done with theirs across 5,000 years and what history quietly did about it in return. You will meet a disgraced Dutch trader who invented the short sale purely out of spite, a private banker who once stopped a national panic from inside his own library, and a woman who carried her considerable fortune around in an old cloth bag rather than trust it to any vault. Somewhere in the next 2 hours, one of these stories will probably explain something about how you already think about money, whether you have ever owned a single share in your life or not. The market had to be built by someone, one small decision at a time, long before anyone thought to give it a name. In Amsterdam, in the summer of 1602, clerks of the newly formed Dutch East India Company opened a subscription book and invited the public to buy a piece of a company that did not yet own a single ship. Merchants, widows, servants, and at least one buyer who signed up for almost nothing at all lined up to write their names beside a sum of money. What they received in return was not a loan and not quite a partnership in the old sense either. It was a share, a permanent, transferable claim on whatever the company earned for as long as the company existed. Trading ventures before this one had raised money the way most risky enterprises always had, voyage by voyage. A group of merchants funded a single trip, split the proceeds when the ships came home, and dissolved the arrangement until the next expedition needed financing again. The Dutch East India Company changed the shape of the bet. Its charter ran for 21 years, and the capital its investors put in was not returned at the end of each voyage. A subscriber who wanted cash back could not simply ask the company for it. They had to find another person willing to buy the claim from them instead. That one requirement, more than the size of the company or the value of its cargo, is what historians usually mean when they call this the birth of the modern share. It forced a market into existence, almost as a side effect. If an investor could not redeem a stake with the company itself, a place to sell it to a stranger had to exist somewhere. Within a few years, brokers in Amsterdam were doing exactly that, meeting first on a bridge and later inside a dedicated exchange building, trading pieces of paper that represented ships most of the traders would never see and cargo that had not yet left the docks of Batavia. Nobody involved called it a stock market. They were solving a narrower problem: how to fund something too large and too risky for any single merchant's purse, without asking investors to wait 2 decades to learn whether it had worked. The solution outlived the problem by centuries. The paper outlasted every ship it was ever written to describe. In the first weeks of 1637, a single tulip bulb named Semper Augustus changed hands in Amsterdam for a sum that could have bought a fine house on one of the city's canals. This was a real transaction for a real, exceptionally rare bulb, striped white and crimson by a virus nobody at the time understood, and it is the single most reliable fact anyone can quote about the entire episode. Tulips had arrived in the Dutch Republic from the Ottoman Empire only a few decades earlier, prized partly because a mysterious mosaic virus caused the rarest bulbs to bloom in unpredictable flame-like streaks of color that could not be reliably bred on purpose. And by the 1630s, they had become a genuine status good, admired the way a rare painting or a fine tapestry might be. A market grew up around the rarest bulbs, then around promises to deliver bulbs still in the ground, and prices for the most sought-after varieties climbed to levels that startled contemporaries as much as they startle us now. For a few months, in a narrow slice of Dutch society, tulip trading was the most talked-about way to grow suddenly wealthy. Where the story usually goes wrong is in the size of the wreckage that followed. Popular retellings describe a whole nation ruined overnight, ordinary bakers and roof thatchers bankrupted by flour speculation. Modern historians, most notably in Goldgar, have gone back through the surviving court records and found something narrower: a specialized trade among a relatively small circle of wealthy merchants and dedicated florists, most of whom seem to have absorbed their losses without the sweeping social collapse the legend describes. The price collapse in February of 1637 was real and sudden. The nationwide ruin is largely a later exaggeration, added a chapter at a time as the story got retold. None of that makes the true version less strange. A flower, prized mainly for a disease that discolored its petals, briefly traded for the price of real estate, and the men paying that price were not considered fools by their neighbors at the time. They were considered shrewd, right up until the week they were not. On the 17th of May, 1792, 24 New York brokers signed a single paragraph of an agreement and dated it under a buttonwood tree that stood outside 68 Wall Street. They promised each other two things: to trade securities only among themselves, giving preference to one another over any outside broker or auctioneer, and to charge no less than 0.25% commission on every transaction. The agreement was not born from confidence. It was born from embarrassment. New York had just lived through its first homegrown speculative bust, a rapid boom and collapse in bank shares and government paper that became known as the Panic of 1792, driven in large part by a speculator named William Duer, who had tried to corner the market in bank stocks using borrowed money, and it had cost him his freedom, landing him in debtor's prison, along with the reputations of several brokers who had lent to him. The city's merchants needed the public to trust that buying and selling securities in New York could be done in an orderly way by a known group of people who would not undercut each other into chaos. The Buttonwood Agreement was less a business plan than a pact to behave. What makes the document remarkable is how little it actually built. There was no building, no seat on an exchange in the sense we would recognize today, no officers, no listing requirements. 24 men had simply agreed on a floor price for their own services and a preference for trading with people they already knew. Everything that followed, the dedicated rooms, the formal board, the eventual name New York Stock Exchange, grew outward from that one paragraph over the following 7 decades. It is worth sitting with how modest the actual founding moment was. No ceremony marked it as historic at the time. No one present is recorded as having said anything memorable. A handful of brokers who wanted to stop undercutting each other put their names on a page, and the page happened to outlive every one of them. The tree is gone, but the agreement in spirit is still the rule. Wall Street is named for an actual wall, and the wall came down less than 50 years after it was built. In 1653, Dutch colonists in New Amsterdam raised a barricade of logs and packed earth along the northern edge of their settlement, roughly where the street runs today, a defensive line meant to hold off an attack from the English colonies to the north, or possibly from Native American nations whose land the settlement continued to encroach upon on the orders of Governor Peter Stuyvesant himself. The attack never came. The wall stood for decades anyway, useful mainly as a boundary marker and a place for residents to graze livestock and dump refuse. By the time the English had taken the colony and renamed it New York, the wall was less a fortification than a nuisance, sagging in places and blocking a street that colonists increasingly wanted to use for ordinary trade. In 1699, the city's council ordered it demolished, and the timber was reportedly sold off or repurposed into other buildings nearby. What survived was simply the path where the wall had stood, which the growing city kept calling by the same name out of habit long after there was nothing there to see. That habit is the interesting part. A defensive structure built out of fear of an invasion that never materialized became, within a single lifetime, nothing more than a name for a street where merchants happened to gather. By the time brokers began meeting there regularly in the following century, few of them would have known or cared that the ground beneath their feet had once been a fortification at all. The wall had done its most lasting work by disappearing. Cities rarely plan which of their old names will survive the buildings behind them. Long after the last log had rotted, the street kept the wall's name and none of its purpose. Centuries before Amsterdam sold its first share, a wealthy Roman could walk toward the Forum and buy a partial stake in a company that collected the Republic's taxes, built its roads, and supplied its armies, then sell that stake to another investor entirely. These companies, known as Societates Publicanorum, bid for government contracts and finance the work by selling divided shares, called partes, to private citizens, some of whom never set foot outside the city. Polybius, writing around the same period, noted that almost the entire population of Rome seemed to hold some financial interest in these public contracts, either directly or through a relative. The arrangement solved a real problem. Rome's government had almost no permanent civil service to collect taxes or manage large infrastructure projects across a growing territory, so it auctioned the work to private companies instead, and those companies needed capital far beyond what any single Roman family typically kept in cash. Selling shares to outside investors spread both the cost and the risk. Cicero, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, mentions the shares of these companies trading at a premium or a discount, depending on how the business of the moment was going, which is about as close to a stock quote as anything the ancient world left behind. Whether this counts as a genuine ancestor of the modern share is a real disagreement among economic historians, not a settled fact dressed up as one. Some point to the transferable partes, the pooled capital, and the price fluctuation as clear evidence of a functioning secondary market. Others argue the comparison flatters Rome, since these companies were fewer in number, tied tightly to state contracts rather than open commerce, and left behind too little evidence to reconstruct exactly how their shares changed hands. Both camps are working from the same handful of surviving fragments. What is not in dispute is that the basic idea, pooling many small stakes into one large undertaking too big for any single purse, is far older than any building called an exchange. Rome's tax collectors are gone, but the argument about what they invented is still being had. By the 1200s, the Republic of Venice had already worked out that a citizen's forced loan to the state could be resold to another citizen for cash. These loans, called prestiti, were not optional. When Venice needed money for a war, the government simply assessed its wealthier citizens and required them to lend a set amount, in exchange for a promise of interest paid out of future tax revenue. Nobody enjoyed being assessed for a forced loan, which is exactly why a market for reselling the obligation grew up almost immediately. A citizen who needed cash sooner than the state's schedule allowed could sell their claim to another Venetian willing to wait for the interest payments instead, and a running price for these claims began to appear, rising when the war was going well and Venice's credit looked solid, falling when a fleet was lost or a treasury ran short. Genoa and Florence developed similar arrangements around their own public debt, Genoa's own consolidated fund eventually growing into the famous Casa di San Giorgio, and by the 14th century, a person in any of these cities could in effect check the going rate for a slice of their government's obligations the way a merchant might check the price of wool at the docks. None of this was built to create a financial market. It was built to fund wars nobody wanted to pay for directly. A secondary market in prestiti emerged because forcing citizens to lend money and then refusing to let them sell the claim would have been an even harder policy to enforce. Venice got its war chest either way. Its citizens got a way to convert an unwanted obligation into something closer to cash whenever they needed it. A tax that nobody wanted to owe became, almost without anyone intending it, one of the first liquid financial markets in Europe. The ledger recorded a debt, the market alone decided what it was actually worth. In medieval Genoa, a single trading voyage could belong to several different investors at once, and none of them needed to leave the harbor to hold a stake in it. Under an arrangement called the commenda, a merchant who stayed home could put up capital for a ship's cargo, while a second merchant, the one who actually sailed with the goods, contributed labor and risk instead of money. When the voyage returned, whatever profit it made was split between the two according to terms agreed before the ship ever left port. The genius of the arrangement was how it separated capital from risk of a very physical kind. A wealthy merchant, too old, too cautious, or simply too busy to spend months at sea, still funded a voyage to the eastern Mediterranean. often splitting that single voyage's financing across several ships or several captains at once. So a shipwreck on one route did not wipe out the entire investment. A captain with skill and nerve but no capital of his own still put a voyage together by finding backers willing to share the eventual reward. Both sides were, in effect, buying a fraction of an outcome that neither one controlled alone. This was centuries before anyone in Genoa would have used a word resembling shareholder, and there was no building where commenda contracts changed hands the way securities would later trade in Amsterdam or London. But the underlying habit of mind that a single risky venture could be sliced into pieces and distributed among several people who never met each other was already common practice among Italian merchants long before any exchange existed to formalize it. Notaries in Genoa's archives recorded thousands of these contracts, ordinary enough at the time that nobody thought to explain them for later readers. A voyage to Alexandria or Tunis carried the same physical danger it always had: storms, piracy, and simple bad luck among them. But the financial danger no longer belonged to one household alone. Spreading a wager across several backers did not make the sea any calmer. It only meant that no single ruin had to be total. A ship still sank or came home whole. What had changed was how many purses felt it either way. In 1494, a Franciscan friar named Luca Pacioli published a mathematics textbook that included, almost as an aside, the first printed explanation of a bookkeeping method that let a merchant prove exactly what he owned and what he owed. The method itself was not his invention. Venetian merchants had already been keeping their accounts this way for at least 2 centuries, recording every transaction twice, once as a debit and once as a matching credit, so that the books had to balance if nothing had gone wrong. Pacioli's contribution was to write the practice down clearly enough that anyone literate in mathematics could learn it from a book instead of an apprenticeship. That distinction between inventing a tool and being the one remembered for it is worth sitting with. Pacioli is still called the father of accounting in most textbooks, a title that overstates his originality and understates how much he actually did. He did not discover double-entry bookkeeping. He noticed that a genuinely useful, quietly spreading merchant habit had never been written down in a form ordinary people could study, and he fixed that gap. Sometimes the person remembered for an idea is simply the first one who explained it well enough for the idea to travel. A market cannot function on trust alone. A buyer of a share in a company, whether in Renaissance Venice or on any exchange after it, needs some way of knowing what the company actually owns, what it owes, and whether its books have been kept honestly enough to believe. Double-entry bookkeeping was the quiet technology that made that kind of verification possible at scale, long before any regulator existed to demand it, and long before anyone had thought to call the practice an industry standard. Pacioli went back to teaching mathematics not long after his book appeared, and seems to have had little sense that he had done anything more than explain a useful trick clearly. The merchants who had used the method for 2 centuries before him left almost no names behind it all. History tends to remember whoever wrote the instructions down, not whoever quietly did the work first. Every share ever sold has rested, at some distance, on a friar's textbook about arithmetic. The word most of the world now uses for a stock exchange traces back to one household in Bruges, and to a coat of arms that had nothing to do with finance. From the 1280s onward, merchants gathered outside a hostelry run by the Van der Berze family, trading bills of exchange and shipping news in the square in front of the building. The family's coat of arms carried 3 purses, Berzen in the Flemish of the time, and the association between that symbol, that family, and the crowd of merchants doing business outside their door proved sticky enough to survive the family itself. By the late 15th century, visitors to Bruges were already describing the square by the family's name, rather than its official one, even as Bruges itself was losing trade to Antwerp as its harbor slowly silted up and became too shallow for the largest merchant ships. A German physician traveling through the city in 1495 wrote in his journal that merchants assembled at a place called De Beurs, using the word as though it needed no further explanation. As trading habits and the merchants who practiced them moved to Antwerp and beyond, the word traveled with them, absorbed into French as Bourse, into German in its own close variation, into Spanish and Italian in theirs. None of those languages borrowed a technical financial term. They borrowed a family name for a building that no longer existed by the time most of them were using the word. There is something almost accidental about a global vocabulary for financial markets, resting on a Flemish innkeeper's heraldry rather than on any deliberate act of naming. Nobody sat down and decided what a stock exchange should be called. A habit of assembling outside one particular door lasted long enough that the door's owners became the word. Centuries later, traders in cities the Van der Berze family never saw are still, without knowing it, saying their name. Isaac Lemaire had already been forced off the board of the Dutch East India Company once, accused of fraud, when he came back in 1609 with a plan aimed squarely at the company that had cast him out. He gathered 9 other investors into a syndicate called the Grote Compagnie, the Great Company, and together they began selling VOC shares they did not actually own, on a promise to deliver them later at whatever the price happened to be by then. The technique is now called short selling, though nobody in Amsterdam had a settled name for it yet, and the syndicate's members reportedly conducted much of their business through intermediaries precisely so their own names would not appear directly on the selling orders. Lemaire's syndicate sold heavily, and according to surviving accounts, spread unflattering rumors about the company's prospects around the bridge and the church where shares changed hands, hoping to talk the price down as hard as they were selling it down. For a while the plan worked. VOC shares, which had traded above double their original subscription price in 1607, slid substantially by 1609, a serious decline for a company most of Amsterdam still assumed was sound, and one that its directors could not simply explain away as ordinary market weather. The company did not take the attack quietly. Its directors paid out the VOC's first ever dividend in 1610, partly to steady nervous shareholders, and successfully petitioned the states of Holland for a ban on selling shares a trader did not actually possess. Lemaire's syndicate, caught holding positions it could no longer legally unwind the way it had planned, came apart within a couple of years, and Lemaire fled Amsterdam to stay ahead of his creditors, dying in obscurity, far from the exchange he had once tried to break. A grudge, and not a theory of markets, produced the first documented short sale. The company survived him, and the tactic he pioneered did not need his permission to survive either. In Amsterdam in 1688, a Sephardic merchant named Joseph de la Vega finished a book unlike anything printed before it, an entire volume devoted to how a stock exchange actually behaves, written as a set of dialogues between a philosopher, a merchant, and a shareholder. Confusione de Confusiones described the VOC market's rallies, its panics, and its gossip in more detail than any government report or merchant's ledger had bothered to record. De la Vega was himself a trader, and his book reads like the notes of someone who had watched a crowd of investors long enough to see the patterns repeat. He described how a rumor could move a price faster than any real news, how professional traders read each other's moods on the exchange floor the way sailors read weather, and how the same handful of psychological triggers, hope, fear, and simple stubbornness, kept reappearing across entirely different booms and busts. The book's very title, meaning roughly Confusion of Confusions, was itself a wry joke about how bewildering the whole enterprise looked to an outsider trying to follow it for the first time. None of this was expressed in the language of a formal theory. It was closer to a field guide, written by someone who had no framework to place his observations in beyond his own careful watching, and who seems to have assumed his readers already knew the exchange well enough to recognize every character he described. What makes the book worth remembering is not any particular prediction it got right, but the plain fact that its central claim, that markets are made of people reacting to each other as much as to the underlying facts, needed almost no updating over the following 3 centuries. Later economists would build entire careers formalizing ideas de la Vega had already sketched in prose, decades before anyone thought to measure a market's mood with a number, and long before anyone had a word for the crowd psychology he was quietly cataloging. The exchange he described has been rebuilt many times over. The behavior he noticed never really needed rebuilding at all. In the final months of the Dutch tulip trade, in the winter of 1636 Into 1637, most of the buying and selling taking place in Amsterdam's taverns was not really about flowers at all. Traders were exchanging contracts for bulbs that would not be dug up until the following summer, agreeing on a price today for delivery months later, a practice that came to be called windhandel, literally wind trade, because there was nothing solid changing hands. Trading shifted almost entirely into ordinary taverns rather than any formal exchange building, since tulip contracts were considered too disreputable or too playful for the serious commodity markets of the day to host officially. This was a different kind of risk than simply paying too much for a rare bulb. A futures contract meant a buyer could commit to a price without having the money in hand yet, and a seller could promise a bulb that had not even flowered, let alone been verified as the prized variety it was sold as. Notaries recorded these deals in regular contract form, complete with witnesses and penalty clauses for a buyer who backed out. But the entire arrangement rested on trust in a chain of promises rather than on any bulb anyone could hold up to the light and inspect for themselves. When prices collapsed in February of 1637, this is exactly why the damage was so hard to calculate. Buyers who owed money for bulbs they had never taken delivery of tried to walk away from contracts that sellers insisted were binding, and Dutch courts spent months afterward sorting out which promises still had to be honored. The dispute was ultimately settled, with buyers allowed to cancel most contracts for a small fee rather than the full agreed price, which is part of why the financial wreckage, whatever its true size, never spread as widely as the legend later claimed it had. The bulbs were real, and the flowers themselves never changed. Only the paper promises circling around them for a few strange months briefly forgot to mention them at all. In 1698, London's Royal Exchange, the city's official marketplace for merchants since the days of Elizabeth I, banned stockbrokers from operating inside its walls, citing their rowdy and disruptive behavior. The brokers did not disband. They simply walked a short distance down the street and set up in Jonathan's coffee house in an alley called Change Alley and carried on much as before. Coffee houses were already a fixture of London commercial life by then. Warm rooms where merchants read newspapers, exchanged news, and did business over hours nobody was in any particular hurry to end, often paying a single penny at the door for as much coffee and gossip as they cared to consume. Jonathan's had one advantage the Royal Exchange never offered. Its owner began posting a regular handwritten list of stock and commodity prices on the wall, a service traders were willing to pay a small fee to see. What had been an eviction turned almost immediately into an improvement. Brokers now had a fixed address, a captive audience of fellow traders, and a shared reference point for what things were actually worth on any given afternoon, something the old exchange floor had never quite offered in so plain a form. Over the following decades, Jonathan's and a handful of nearby coffee houses became so central to London's securities trade that the phrase Change Alley came to stand for the stock market itself in ordinary conversation, the way Wall Street would later stand for New York's. Nobody had designed this outcome. A pack of brokers thrown out of one building had simply found the nearest room willing to have them, and that room's owner had happened to hit on the one service, a visible price list, that turned a coffee house into something closer to an exchange. An eviction meant to end the broker's business as a nuisance ended up giving that business its first real home, its first shared address, and its first daily habit worth keeping. In the first months of 1720, shares in Britain's South Sea Company rose from roughly £100 to over £1,000 within a matter of months, propelled less by the company's actual trade with South America, which was modest and often blocked by Spain, than by a public conviction that the price could only keep climbing. By autumn, the shares had collapsed back toward their starting point, wiping out fortunes that had existed, on paper, only weeks before. The company's real plan had been to take on a large share of Britain's national debt in exchange for a monopoly on South American trade under the Asiento Agreement, a scheme that depended on investors believing the trade itself, mostly in enslaved people and modest cargoes Spain grudgingly permitted, would eventually become immensely profitable. It barely needed to be for a while. As the share price climbed, the company sweetened the story with new stock issues and rumors of forthcoming riches. And a wave of imitator companies sprang up, promising ventures nearly as vague. One famously advertised only as a company for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. Parliament, bankers, and ordinary investors across British society, including members of the aristocracy who should have known better, poured money in anyway. When the collapse came, it came fast enough that many investors who had bought near the peak were ruined within weeks, and the fallout reached into Parliament itself, where several members were found to have taken bribes connected to the scheme. English speakers have called this kind of collapse a bubble ever since, precisely because the South Sea Company's rise had so little substance behind it, all air and surface tension until the moment it simply popped. The company's actual ships kept sailing to South America long after its shares had stopped meaning anything at all. Isaac Newton, already the most famous scientist in Britain, sold his South Sea Company stock in the spring of 1720 at a healthy profit, then watched the price keep climbing without him, and bought back in near the top, only to lose a substantial part of his personal fortune when the bubble collapsed months later. The most familiar version of Newton's reaction, a line about being able to calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies but not the madness of people, is more polished than what he is actually recorded as having said. The earliest known account, gathered decades later by a friend of a friend and published long after Newton's death, has him remarking only that he could not calculate the madness of the people, a plainer and less quotable sentence that later writers dressed up with the astronomical flourish because the story worked better with it. Whether Newton spoke either version exactly as written is impossible to confirm at this distance, but the loss itself and his frustration at having been right once and wrong the second time are well documented in his own correspondence and in the accounts of people who knew him personally. Newton reportedly banned the mention of the South Sea Company in his household for the rest of his life, unwilling to be reminded of the loss, even in casual conversation. What makes the story worth keeping, embellishment and all, is the specific shape of the mistake. Newton did not lose his money through ignorance. He understood the company's business at least as well as any investor in London, sold at a sensible moment, and then let the sight of a rising price talk him back into a market his own first instinct had already told him to leave. A gift for calculation, it turns out, is not the same gift as knowing when to stop watching the number climb. The planets kept their orbits, and the price never went back to where he sold it the second time. After the South Sea bubble collapsed in 1720, the British Parliament passed a law making it illegal to form a new joint stock company anywhere in the country without an Act of Parliament or a royal charter specifically permitting it, and the restriction stood, largely unrepealed in practice, for more than 100 years. The Bubble Act was less a considered piece of financial regulation than a furious response to a very specific embarrassment. One Parliament itself had been slow to notice, while share prices were still climbing. Dozens of flimsy companies had sprung up alongside the South Sea Company itself, some selling shares in schemes that barely pretended to have a real business behind them, and Parliament wanted to be seen stopping the practice cold. The law achieved that narrow goal. What it also did, almost as a side effect, was choke off the ordinary formation of new companies in Britain for generations, since anyone wanting to raise capital through tradable shares now needed the explicit blessing of Parliament, a slow and politically fraught process most ordinary merchants could not realistically pursue on their own behalf. Historians still argue over how much this single law slowed British industrial development during exactly the period the Industrial Revolution was gathering pace, since entrepreneurs who might otherwise have raised capital through shares were pushed instead toward partnerships and family money, arrangements that worked but scaled far less easily across a growing economy. The act was formally repealed only in 1825, more than a century after the panic that produced it, by which point Britain had already built its early industrial economy largely around alternatives to the very structure the law had restricted. A law written in anger, to punish one summer's excess, ended up quietly shaping how an entire country raised money for the better part of the following century, long after anyone still remembered the panic that had provoked it. Edward Lloyd's Coffee House, opened near the London docks in the 1680s, began as an ordinary room where sailors, ship captains, and merchants gathered to trade news along with their coffee. And it grew, without any single person planning the outcome, into the source of the first regularly published list anywhere of which ships had arrived safely, which were overdue, and which had gone down entirely. Merchants who insured cargo, or who simply had money riding on a ship's safe arrival, needed exactly this kind of information, faster than official channels could reliably supply it. And Lloyd's became the natural clearinghouse for it because sailors and captains were already walking through the door with the freshest word from the docks. By 1734, the coffee house had begun publishing Lloyd's List, a regular sheet of shipping news and insurance rates that is still printed today, making it one of the oldest continuously operating publications in the world, older even than most of the newspapers that would later report on it. The insurance business that grew up alongside it, known simply as Lloyd's of London, eventually became one of the most important institutions in the entire history of underwriting risk, far outlasting the coffee house that gave it a name. What is easy to miss in the story is how naturally the information market and the money market grew up side by side, feeding each other from the start. A ship's captain telling a room full of merchants what he had seen at sea was in effect the earliest version of financial reporting, and the men making bets on the ship's safe return were in effect the earliest version of an insurance market. Neither one could have functioned for long without the other close by. The coffee at Lloyd's has long since gone cold, the original room long since rebuilt beyond recognition, but the list of ships, in one form or another, is still being kept to this day. For more than a century after London's brokers were pushed out of the Royal Exchange, anyone could show up at a coffee house in Change Alley and start buying and selling securities, with no membership, no dues, and no rule stopping a dishonest trader from cheating a customer and simply walking to the next coffee house the following morning. In 1801, London's brokers finally built themselves a dedicated exchange with a subscription fee, a formal membership list, and rules that could get a member expelled for misconduct. The change did not happen because anyone had a sudden flash of insight about how markets in general ought to be organized, and the new building's own subscription committee spent its early years fielding complaints about members who still tried to conduct unlicensed side deals in the surrounding coffee houses out of old habit. It happened because the old and formal system had accumulated enough bad actors and enough merchant complaints about them that London's more reputable brokers wanted a way to separate themselves from the crowd. Paying a subscription and submitting to a rulebook was, in effect, a way of signaling to the public that a broker had something to lose by cheating them. A membership he could be stripped of, and a reputation among his fellow subscribers he could not easily rebuild anywhere else in the city. The building itself was almost beside the point. What mattered was that London's securities trade now had a gate, and a gatekeeper, for the first time in over 100 years of informal coffeehouse dealing. A broker who wanted access to the largest pool of London capital now had to earn a seat and keep it, rather than simply showing up wherever the crowd happened to be that particular week. A line of credit, in the end, was really only ever a line of trust between strangers, and 1801 was simply the year London's brokers finally decided that trust was worth writing down on paper and enforcing with a lock on the door. In 1720, a Scottish financier named John Law convinced the French crown to let him establish a national bank that issued paper currency, and to grant a trading company he controlled, the Mississippi Company, a monopoly over France's vast and largely unexplored Louisiana territory. Shares in the company rose so quickly that ordinary Parisians reportedly became wealthy within weeks of buying in, and Law himself was, for a brief stretch, arguably the richest and most powerful commoner in Europe. Law had first pitched a version of this idea to the French government years earlier from Scotland, after killing a man in a duel back home and fleeing prosecution, and only found a government desperate enough to actually try it once France's finances lay in ruins after years of war. The scheme's appeal rested on a genuinely clever idea that a country's money supply did not need to be tied to gold and silver, and could instead be expanded to match the promise of a growing economy. Law's bank printed notes backed by confidence in the Mississippi Company's future earnings, rather than by metal sitting in a vault, and for a while, the arrangement let France pay down crushing war debts, while its citizens felt richer than they had in decades. The trouble was that the actual Louisiana trade never came close to producing the profits the share price implied. And once a few large investors began quietly converting their paper gains back into gold, the public noticed and rushed to do the same. By the autumn of 1720, both the shares and the currency backing them had collapsed together, since law had tied the two so closely that a crisis in one immediately became a crisis in the other. And there was no separate, sturdier currency left standing for panicked investors to retreat into. Law fled France in disguise, and the country's appetite for paper money and joint stock speculation soured for a generation. A clever idea about money outran by several years the plain, unglamorous business of actually growing crops in Louisiana. And France spent much of the following century recovering from how far ahead of the harvest its paper had run. At the height of the Mississippi Company's rise in 1719, the narrow Rue Quincampoix in Paris grew so crowded with people trying to buy and sell shares that the city eventually had to gate the street shut at night, simply to clear it. Accounts from the period describe nobles, servants, and foreign visitors trading shoulder to shoulder in the same alley, with reports of a hunchbacked man renting out his own back as a portable writing desk for contracts, charging a fee for every signature made against him. One popular account claims a Prince of Conti made several 100,000 livres in a single day simply by reselling shares he had bought that same morning, a story repeated often enough at the time that it likely inspired plenty of imitators. The street had no particular history as a financial center before that year. It simply happened to be where John Law's company had set up its share office, and the crowd assembled wherever the office was. Rents on the surrounding buildings reportedly multiplied many times over within months, as speculators paid enormous sums for rooms overlooking the action, and stories circulated of servants and coachmen who had made small fortunes overnight simply by being present at the right hour with a little spare cash. Whether every individual tale was exactly true hardly mattered at the time. The street had become a kind of open theater where anyone could watch the mania happen in real time, in a way no formal trading floor, with its walls and its members, had ever put on display before. Within a year, the same street stood comparatively empty, its rented rooms vacated, its temporary fortunes mostly gone the way they had come. Rue Quincampoix is an ordinary Paris street today, unmarked by any of it. For one crowded year, an entire nation's appetite for a new idea gathered on a single narrow street built from nothing of the kind, and then dispersed again almost as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the street to go back to being simply a street. Among the oldest surviving financial documents anywhere are small clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia, pressed with a merchant's agreement to accept payment now for goods, most often barley or other grain, that would not exist until the harvest came in months later. Baked hard and stored for millennia, some of these forward contracts have survived in far better condition than paper records written thousands of years afterward. Many of these tablets come from the archives of temples and palaces, which often acted as the era's largest lenders and grain merchants combined, functioning as something close to an early bank long before coined money existed anywhere. The arrangement solved a problem every farmer and grain merchant has recognized since. A harvest is unpredictable, and a fixed price agreed in advance protects both sides from the swings that weather and luck can cause between planting and reaping. A merchant who needed grain for a caravan or a temple storehouse could lock in a supply months ahead, while a farmer facing an uncertain season could secure at least some income before a single seed had sprouted. Scribes recorded the terms carefully, sometimes with witnesses named on the tablet itself, and the fact that these documents needed enforcing at all tells us that a forward promise about an unharvested crop was already 4,000 years ago considered a real and legally bindable kind of property, worth the trouble of pressing into clay rather than simply trusting to memory. No institution called a futures exchange existed to standardize these contracts or make them easy to resell to a third party, and each agreement remained, as far as anyone can tell, a private matter strictly between the two parties who had signed it. but the essential leap of imagination that a promise about a future harvest could be treated with the same seriousness as a sack of grain already in hand needed no later civilization to invent it from nothing. The clay has outlasted the grain, the granary, and the civilization that built both by roughly 4,000 years. In the Japanese city of Osaka, merchants gathered from the late 1600s onward at a market in the Dojima district to trade rice that had not yet been harvested, agreeing on prices for future delivery in a level of organized detail that would not appear anywhere in Europe for more than a century afterward. The market received its first formal license from the shogunate around 1697, and by the early 1700s, a recognizable system of standardized futures contracts, known as nobemai, had taken shape around it. Merchants at Dojima traded almost entirely on the basis of rice certificates, called kome-kite, rather than actual sacks of grain changing hands on the spot. Since physically moving that much rice for every transaction would have been impossibly slow. Rice was not simply a foodstuff in Japan's economy at the time. It was the currency in which the samurai class was paid, since feudal lords and their retainers received fixed stipends measured in koku of rice rather than in coin. This made a functioning rice market essential to the entire social order, not just to merchants, and it explains why the market at Dojima grew so quickly into something far more sophisticated than an ordinary farmer's exchange. Brokers there developed clearing arrangements, standardized contract sizes, and settlement rules that would look familiar to anyone who has studied the mechanics of a modern futures exchange, all of it built to manage a staple grain rather than any metal or paper claim. The shogunate eventually granted the Dojima exchange full official recognition in 1730, cementing rules that had mostly grown up through the merchant's own practice rather than through any government design. The market operated for over 2 centuries before it was finally absorbed into a state rice agency in the 20th century. Long before anyone in London or Amsterdam had organized anything resembling a futures pit, Osaka's rice brokers were already settling standardized contracts for a harvest that had not yet left the field, on a scale European merchants would not attempt for another 100 years. In 1848, a group of Chicago grain merchants, tired of watching wagon loads of wheat and corn rot on the docks while buyers and sellers haggled endlessly over price and quality, founded the Chicago Board of Trade to bring some order to the chaos. Within a few decades, the exchange had standardized what a contract for grain actually meant, specifying an exact grade, a fixed delivery date, and a set quantity, so that a trade could be agreed in minutes rather than negotiated wagon by wagon. The board eventually built its own towering headquarters on LaSalle Street, topped by a large statue of the Roman goddess Ceres, fittingly facing away from the city as though watching over the farmland that fed its trading floor. Before standardization, buying grain meant physically inspecting each shipment, since quality varied enormously between one farmer's harvest and another's, and a buyer in Chicago had no simple way to compare a rail car arriving from Iowa with one arriving from Illinois. The Board of Trade's graders assigned each shipment a quality classification, after which a bushel of a given grade became, for trading purposes, interchangeable with any other bushel of that same grade, regardless of which farm it had actually come from. That single innovation, turning a physical commodity into an abstract tradable unit, let merchants buy and sell grain that had not yet arrived, or in some cases had not yet been grown, months ahead of the actual harvest. Railroads, which were expanding across the Midwest at almost exactly the same pace as the exchange itself, needed precisely this kind of standardized, fast-moving trade to keep grain flowing efficiently from farm to port without ruinous pileups at either end. The Board of Trade and the railroads grew up leaning on each other, one moving the grain physically, the other moving the promises about it on paper. A farmer in Iowa could now sell a harvest he had not yet planted to a buyer in Chicago he would never meet, on terms neither of them had to negotiate from scratch. Before 1867, a stock price in New York traveled only as fast as a messenger boy could run it between a broker's office and the trading floor, which meant that anyone more than a few streets away was, in practical terms, always working from slightly stale information. Edward Callahan, an inventor working for the American Telegraph Company, solved this by building a machine that printed stock prices automatically onto a moving strip of paper, transmitted by telegraph the moment a trade was recorded. Callahan had previously worked on stock printing telegraphs for the Gold and Stock Telegraph Company, and he reportedly built his first working model using little more than spare telegraph parts and a converted printing press mechanism. Callahan's ticker, unveiled in November of 1867, let a broker's office across town, or eventually across the country, see roughly the same price a trader on the floor had just agreed to, compressed from the delay of a running messenger down to the delay of an electrical signal. The machine got its name from the distinctive ticking sound its type wheel made as it printed, a sound that would become the background noise of American finance for the following century, familiar to anyone who ever stood near a brokerage window. Brokerage offices without direct access to the exchange floor could now, for the first time, follow a trading day almost as it happened, rather than reconstructing it hours later from secondhand reports. The ticker did not just speed up information, it quietly narrowed the advantage that had always belonged to whoever happened to be standing closest to the action, since a broker in Philadelphia or Boston could now watch New York prices update through the day nearly as fast as a broker standing on the exchange floor itself. Distance, which had always meant a real disadvantage in this business, mattered measurably less than it had the week before. A machine built simply to save messengers' legs ended up reshaping, in a quiet and mostly unnoticed way, who could realistically compete in the market at all. In the spring of 1896, a financial journalist named Charles Dow took the closing prices of 12 companies, mostly railroads and industrial firms, added them together, and divided by 12, producing a single number meant to describe the general direction of the American stock market on any given day. He had no elaborate theory behind the selection. He simply chose companies he judged to be broadly representative of the country's major industries at the time. The original 12 companies included firms making cotton, sugar, tobacco, and rubber, and only General Electric among them survives in any recognizable corporate form on the modern index. Dow was not trying to build a scientific instrument. He ran a financial news service with his partner Edward Jones, and newspaper readers wanted something simpler than pages of individual stock prices to answer one basic question: was the market, broadly speaking, up or down today? A single average, however roughly constructed, gave editors a number they could print in a headline, and readers a number they could remember from one day to the next, in a way that a full table of prices never could. The choice of companies changed over the years as industries rose and fell, and the method of calculating the average was later adjusted more than once, but the basic habit Dow started, boiling an entire day's trading across an enormous economy down to one figure, proved impossible to shake. Generations of investors, journalists, and ordinary people with no particular interest in finance have since checked that number, or one of its many descendants, as a kind of daily weather report for the economy as a whole, largely because Dow's original shortcut was simple enough that anyone could understand what it claimed to be measuring. A rough average, built from a dozen companies a working journalist happened to trust one spring, became the single number an entire country would spend the next century checking first, before almost anything else in the financial page. The year after 24 New York brokers signed the Buttonwood Agreement outdoors in 1792, they moved their trading indoors, into a room rented inside the newly built Tontine Coffee House at the corner of Wall and Water Streets. The building had been financed through a tontine, an arrangement in which subscribers pooled money and the survivors' shares grew larger as other subscribers gradually died off, itself a small, strange piece of financial history layered underneath the larger one about to happen upstairs on the trading floor. A tree and a handshake had settled the rules of trading among the founding brokers. A coffee house gave the new arrangement its first roof, its first fixed hours, and its first proper address that a merchant unfamiliar with the city could actually be directed to find. Visitors' accounts from the period describe a crowded, noisy room where brokers shouted prices across tables still cluttered with coffee cups and the occasional half-finished meal. Merchants conducted ordinary business alongside the securities trading, and newcomers to New York were sometimes startled to learn that the city's entire stock market operated out of what still functioned most of the day as an ordinary place to get a hot drink. The brokers eventually outgrew the coffee house and moved to dedicated exchange rooms of their own within a few decades. First to a purpose-built exchange room nearby, and later to the grander buildings the exchange would occupy through the following century. But the pattern set at the Tontine, an outdoor agreement quickly finding an indoor home, would repeat itself in one form or another as the exchange kept expanding and relocating over the following century. Nothing about the actual building survives today, except its name, kept alive mostly in historical markers, old prints, and the occasional plaque a passerby rarely stops to read. A tree gave New York's stock market its founding promise, and a coffee house within a year gave that promise its first four walls. New York's brokers did not formally adopt the name most people now associate with their institution for a surprisingly long time. The organization that grew out of the Buttonwood Agreement called itself the New York Stock and Exchange Board starting in 1817, a title that sounds almost apologetically bureaucratic next to what the institution eventually became. And it was not until 1863 that the members voted to shorten it to the New York Stock Exchange. The organization had briefly operated even earlier under a looser structure before formally adopting its 1817 Constitution, modeled in part on the rules already used by the Philadelphia Exchange. In the intervening decades, the board had already built most of the machinery that would go on to define American securities trading for the next century. A formal roll of members, a physical trading floor with assigned posts for different stocks, and a growing body of rules governing exactly how a trade had to be conducted and recorded. What it had not yet settled, oddly enough, was simply what to call all of this, and for nearly 50 years the more cumbersome names stuck stiffly in official documents, on letterhead, and in the newspapers that covered its daily business, even as ordinary New Yorkers had likely long since taken to calling it something shorter in everyday conversation. The 1863 renaming coincided with the Civil War, a period when trading volumes and government bond issuance both rose sharply across the Union, and the shorter name may simply have reflected an institution that finally felt confident enough in its own permanence to stop describing itself so cautiously to strangers. Whatever the exact reasoning, the new name stuck immediately and has never been changed since, outlasting the building, the floor, and nearly every practice the board had originally been formed to govern. An institution can operate for decades on real authority, real rules, and a real trading floor, long before it finally settles on what to call itself in public. In October of 1907, with several New York banks failing and depositors lining up in the streets to withdraw their savings before their own bank went under too, the man who effectively stopped the panic was not a government official, but an aging private financier named J.P. Morgan, who gathered the city's leading bankers into his personal library and told each of them how much they were going to lend. Morgan reportedly locked the doors of his library at one point, keeping a room full of exhausted bank presidents inside until they agreed on a rescue plan among themselves. Morgan held no formal office that gave him the authority to do any of this. The United States had no central bank at the time capable of acting as a lender of last resort, and the Treasury's own tools for calming a banking panic were limited and slow. What Morgan had instead was decades of relationships, a reputation for financial judgment nobody in the room wanted to publicly doubt, and enough of his own money at stake that other bankers trusted his read of the crisis more than they trusted their own. Working through the night in his library on 36th Street, he assembled emergency loans, pressured reluctant bank presidents into contributing, and even helped broker a deal to save the city of New York itself from defaulting on its short-term debt. The panic passed within weeks, largely because enough of the financial system believed Morgan had the situation under control, which in practice meant enough of it behaved as though the situation actually was under control. The episode worked exactly once, and it worked because one extraordinarily well-connected private citizen happened to be willing and able to do it. A country that had just watched its entire financial system saved by one man's personal word and one night's work in a private library began asking almost immediately what would happen the next time that particular man was simply unavailable. 6 years after J.P. Morgan personally organized a rescue of the American banking system from his own private library, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, creating a system of regional reserve banks explicitly designed so that the job of stopping a financial panic would never again depend on the goodwill of one extraordinarily wealthy private citizen. Senator Nelson Aldrich, who had watched the 1907 rescue unfold from close range, went on to chair the commission whose research laid much of the groundwork for the eventual legislation. The 1907 panic had exposed an uncomfortable truth that many in Washington had been reluctant to say aloud. The world's largest economy had no institution capable of acting as a lender of last resort during a crisis, and it had gotten lucky that Morgan happened to be willing, able, and trusted enough to fill that role informally when the moment came. Lawmakers spent the following years arguing over how much power any new central banking system should have and who should control it, wary of concentrating too much authority either in Washington or in the hands of the same Wall Street bankers who had just demonstrated, for better or worse, how much influence a small circle of private financiers already held over the country's money. The compromise that emerged split authority between a Washington-based board and 12 regional reserve banks scattered across the country, an arrangement built as much around distributing distrust evenly as around any single theory of how central banking should work. It has been amended many times since, but the basic reasoning behind its creation, that panics are a structural feature of banking systems rather than rare accidents, and ought to be managed by a standing institution rather than improvised by whichever banker happens to be rich enough at the time, has never really gone away. What one wealthy man had managed to do once, from his own private library, a country finally decided it needed a permanent public institution to do reliably from then on. In September of 1873, the failure of a single prominent banking house, J. Cook and Company, triggered a financial panic severe enough that the New York Stock Exchange closed its doors for 10 straight days, the first time in its history it had ever shut down entirely rather than simply keep trading through a bad week. J. Cook had made his name and his firm's reputation financing the Union war effort during the Civil War through the innovative mass sale of government bonds directly to ordinary citizens rather than only to large banks, and afterward turned his firm's considerable reputation toward financing the Northern Pacific Railway, a transcontinental line meant to open the American Northwest to settlement and trade. The railway proved far more expensive to build and far slower to attract paying traffic than Cook's financing plans had assumed, and when his firm could no longer sell enough bonds to cover its obligations, it collapsed almost overnight, dragging a wave of connected banks and brokerages down with it. Because railroads by this point had absorbed such an enormous share of the entire era's investment capital, a single overextended railroad financier's failure was enough to freeze credit across the whole country within a matter of days, long before news of it had even reached every regional bank. The downturn that followed lasted years rather than weeks, contributing to what contemporaries simply called the Long Depression, a period of falling prices, business failures, and labor unrest that stretched through much of the 1870s. Railroads would go on to trigger similar panics more than once in the following decades, since their financing needs were so large and their actual returns so often slower to arrive than their bond prospectuses had promised investors. A single overextended railroad man's failure closed Wall Street's doors for 10 days before the country had even finished counting the wider damage still spreading outward from his firm. In 1873, the same year J. Cook's failure was closing the New York Stock Exchange, an English journalist named Walter Bagehot published a short, plainly written book arguing that a central bank facing a financial panic had one job, and that the job was simple to state even if it took nerve to carry out: lend freely against good collateral at a punishingly high rate of interest. Lombard Street was not really a work of original theory, so much as a careful description of how the Bank of England's more capable officials already behaved when a panic hit, written down so the practice would not depend on any one banker's memory or nerve surviving to the next crisis. Bagehot himself edited the Economist magazine for much of his career, and Lombard Street grew directly out of his close observation of exactly how the Bank of England had actually behaved during the panic unfolding around him that same year. Bagehot's reasoning was almost stubbornly practical. Lending freely kept solvent banks from failing simply because they had briefly run out of cash. Demanding good collateral kept the central bank from bailing out institutions that were genuinely insolvent rather than merely illiquid. Charging a high rate of interest discouraged banks from treating the emergency lending as a cheap, permanent source of funds rather than a last resort meant for genuine emergencies only. What made the book quietly radical was its underlying assumption that panics were a normal, recurring feature of banking rather than rare acts of God, and that a central bank's proper response could therefore be planned in advance rather than improvised anew every time. Central bankers on both sides of the Atlantic have cited Bagehot's rule ever since, often nearly word for word, whenever a new crisis forces the same old question back onto the table. A plainly written book about lending freely but on hard terms became, almost by accident, the closest thing central banking has ever had to a founding instruction manual, still quoted at nearly every fresh crisis since. In the 1840s, Britain's investors poured so much money into newly proposed railway companies that for a brief and feverish stretch, the total mileage of track under formal proposal exceeded anything the country could plausibly have built, let alone profitably operated, in a single generation. Parliament received applications for hundreds of new lines within a few short years, many backed by little more than an ambitious promoter, a printed prospectus, and a public suddenly and thoroughly convinced that railway shares, whichever company issued them, could only ever go up in value. George Hudson, a linen draper from York turned railway financier, nicknamed the Railway King by the press of the day, once controlled roughly a third of all railway track then operating in Britain, became the era's most visible symbol of the boom, assembling a sprawling network of lines through aggressive promotion, favorable press coverage he had quietly helped arrange, and accounting practices that paid shareholder dividends partly out of new capital rather than out of actual operating profit. For a few years, Hudson was among the most powerful commercial figures in Britain, courted by investors and politicians alike, his name alone reportedly enough to make a new railway scheme's shares sell out within days of being offered. When railway share prices collapsed later in the decade, thousands of investors, many of them modest clergymen, clerks, and widows who had never speculated in anything before, lost significant savings, and Hudson's own accounting practices were exposed and his reputation destroyed within a matter of months. The railways themselves, unlike the speculation that had financed so many of them, mostly got built anyway and went on to genuinely transform how Britain moved people and goods for the following century. The track that a nation's mania financed outlasted both the mania itself and the man who had promoted so much of it the loudest, his own name largely forgotten outside railway history books. In March of 1924, a small group of trustees in Boston opened something new, a fund that let an ordinary saver buy a single small stake spread across dozens of different companies at once, and sell that stake back at a fair published price on essentially any business day the saver chose. The Massachusetts Investors Trust is generally credited as the first fund of its kind in the United States, a structure still known today as an open-end fund, and remarkably, a version of it still operates under a similar name a full century later. The trust's founders had reportedly grown frustrated watching their own wealthy clients struggle to manage scattered individual stock holdings sensibly, and designed the new structure partly to solve that exact problem for people much like themselves. Before this innovation, pooled investing had mostly existed in the form of closed-end trusts, which issued a fixed number of shares that then traded on an exchange at whatever price buyers and sellers happened to agree on, a price that could drift well above or below the actual value of the underlying investments, depending on the market's mood. The open-end structure solved that mismatch directly. The fund calculated the value of its holdings each day and stood ready to issue new shares or redeem existing ones at that calculated price. So an investor's stake was always worth what the underlying companies were actually worth, no more clouded by market sentiment than the sum of its parts. The practical effect reached well beyond Boston. A school teacher or a shopkeeper with a modest sum to invest could now spread that money across dozens of companies and industries, without needing to research each one individually or pay a broker to assemble the same spread by hand, a kind of diversification that had previously belonged mostly to the genuinely wealthy. A fund built so that no single saver ever had to pick a loan quietly opened pooled investing to millions of people who had never been able to afford anything like it before that spring in Boston. The New York Stock Exchange did not admit a woman as a full member with her own trading seat until 1967, more than a century and a half after its founding, when Muriel Siebert finally bought her way onto the floor, after being turned down by 9 different male members she had approached to sponsor her application before a 10th finally agreed. Siebert had originally arrived in New York from Cleveland with little money and no college degree, having left Western Reserve University before finishing, and had already built a substantial career as a securities analyst by the time she decided to apply for a seat of her own, and the exchange's own rules required an existing member to formally sponsor any new applicant, a requirement that turned out to function, whether by deliberate design or simple long habit, as an effective barrier against admitting anyone the existing membership was not already entirely comfortable with. 9 refusals in a row before a 10th member agreed to sponsor her tells its own story more plainly than any official policy document from the period ever could. Even after her sponsor was finally secured, Siebert reportedly had to provide additional financial guarantees that male applicants of comparable standing were not typically asked to produce at all, before the exchange's own membership committee would finally approve her application. Her arrival did not immediately transform the floor into an equal place. Women remained a small minority among exchange members for decades afterward, and Siebert herself later described the early years as isolating in ways her male colleagues rarely had to think about at all. But the door, at least, was formally open from that point on, in a way it simply had not been for the exchange's entire previous history. It took the exchange over 170 years of existence, and 10 separate men's individual permission, one after another, to finally let a single woman onto its own trading floor. For most of the 20th century, the loudest and most crowded room in American finance ran, alongside its shouting, on an entire private sign language, developed so that brokers standing only a few feet apart could still communicate clearly over noise too constant and too loud for ordinary speech to carry reliably. Traders on exchange floors used their palms, fingers, and posture to signal whether they wanted to buy or sell, how many shares or contracts, and at roughly what price, a system precise enough that experienced floor traders could execute complex orders across a crowded pit using nothing but hand shapes and eye contact. A palm facing inward toward the trader's own body typically meant buying, a palm facing outward and away from the body meant selling, and specific finger positions held against the forehead, chin, or chest indicated price levels, month codes, or quantities, an entire working vocabulary that took new floor traders months to learn fluently and years to use as quickly as the veterans around them. The culture that grew up around this open outcry system, the shouting, the paper order tickets, the sheer physical density of hundreds of traders packed into a single pit, was its own distinct way of doing business, built around proximity and speed in a way that had nothing metaphorical about it. A trader's actual physical position in the crowd could determine whether he got a fair price or a bad one. Electronic trading has since replaced open outcry on almost every major exchange, and most of the traders who once worked the pits fluently in hand signals have retired, moved on, or simply stopped needing a skill nobody left to trade with still recognizes. A vanished trading floor once ran, every single working day for the better part of a century, on a language spoken almost entirely with the hands rather than the voice. Hetty Green was, by most contemporary accounts, the richest woman in America by the time of her death in 1916, and she was known to carry her most important financial papers around loose in an old cloth bag rather than trust them to a bank vault, dressed the entire time in the same plain, unfashionable black clothing that eventually earned her the newspaper nickname the Witch of Wall Street. Green had inherited a substantial whaling fortune from her family, and unlike many heirs of her era, chose to actively manage and grow it herself rather than hand it to a bank, building her fortune further by lending money and buying distressed bonds and real estate during exactly the panics, including the Panic of 1907, that ruined many other investors around her, holding large amounts of cash in reserve precisely so she could act decisively when everyone else was forced to sell. She was, by all accounts, an unusually skilled and disciplined investor in an era that rarely took women investors seriously at all. and she reportedly negotiated loan terms personally with bankers who underestimated her at their own expense more than once. Her personal frugality, meanwhile, became almost as famous as her wealth. Newspapers delighted in stories of her riding public transportation rather than hiring a private carriage, and haggling over small grocery bills despite a fortune estimated by the standards of her era in the tens of millions. Whether every specific anecdote about her thrift was reported with perfect accuracy is harder to confirm than the basic outline of her career, which her own business records and legal disputes document clearly enough. The gap between how the very wealthy are generally imagined, surrounded by visible comfort, and how at least one of the wealthiest people in America actually chose to live, remains the more interesting part of her story than any single figure attached to her net worth. She kept her fortune the way she kept her reputation, plainly and largely on her own terms. J. E. Livermore built and lost several separate multi-million-dollar fortunes across a trading career that ran from the final years of the 19th century through the first decades of the 20th, going broke entirely more than once, and then rebuilding his wealth from close to nothing each time, largely through the same methods that had made and then unmade him before. Livermore reportedly began trading as a teenager, working as a board boy in a Boston brokerage, chalking up prices before he had a single dollar of his own invested, and became famous among his contemporaries for reading the tape, meaning the plain, continuous record of prices and trading volume printed hour by exchange tickers, rather than studying the underlying businesses whose shares he actually traded, a discipline that let him make some of the largest and most celebrated trades of his entire era, including a fortune reportedly made by correctly anticipating both the 1907 panic and, decades later, the 1929 crash as well. He was equally famous for an inability to stay disciplined once he had made real money, repeatedly abandoning the careful rules he had written for himself in calmer moments as soon as a winning streak convinced him the usual caution no longer applied to him personally. The pattern repeated across his career with an almost mechanical regularity. Patient, rule-bound trading built a fortune, growing confidence and looser discipline put that fortune at risk again, and a market move he had failed to protect against took much of it away, sometimes within a matter of only a few weeks, occasionally within days. Financial writers have studied his career for a century since, less for any specific technique worth copying than for how clearly it demonstrates that knowing the right rules and actually following them under pressure are two entirely different skills. He read the tape better than almost anyone of his era, but reading his own temperament, it turned out, proved to be the far harder discipline of the two. For over a century, a popular story held that Nathan Rothschild secretly learned the outcome of the Battle of Waterloo a full day before the British government's own official messenger arrived, and used that advanced knowledge to manipulate the London bond market into a personal fortune, first spreading a false rumor of British defeat to crash prices, then quietly buying up bonds at the bottom before the true news broke. Rothschild had, in fact, built the London branch of his family's banking network into one of the most formidable in Europe well before Waterloo, largely through disciplined, unglamorous lending rather than any single dramatic coup. The story, in its most dramatic form, first appeared in print decades after Rothschild's death. In an 1846 pamphlet published anonymously under the name Satan, a piece of writing designed less to record history accurately than to paint Rothschild as a sinister, scheming manipulator, and the tale only grew more elaborate as later writers embellished it further across the following decades. What historians who have examined the Rothschild family's own private archives have found is considerably less cinematic. Nathan's courier really did cross the channel and reach London roughly a day ahead of the government's own official dispatch, and Rothschild did purchase government bonds before the price rose sharply on the public announcement, but at a scale far more modest than the legend describes, and with no real evidence at all of the deliberate false rumor or the dramatic market cornering the anonymous pamphlet invented decades later. The family's wartime finances, in fact, had been arranged around expectations of a considerably longer campaign, meaning the sudden peace disrupted other parts of their sprawling business in ways that likely offset much of whatever modest gain they made from the early bond purchase itself, a detail the pamphlet naturally left out entirely. A one-day head start on genuinely accurate news became, across more than a century of eager retelling, an entirely invented conspiracy that comfortably outlived every honest, far duller account of what had actually happened at the time. In 1841, a young Scottish journalist named Charles Mackay published a thick book collecting history's financial manias and popular follies under one memorable title, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, and in doing so gave tulip mania and the South Sea Bubble their lasting place in popular memory far more thoroughly than any original source from either event ever quite managed on its own. Mackay went on to a long career in journalism and poetry after the book's publication, and seems never to have revisited or corrected its more exaggerated chapters, even as his own career gave him ample later opportunity to do so. Mackay was a working journalist rather than a trained historian, and he wrote in the brisk, colorful style of a newspaper feature, rather than the careful, footnoted style of an academic study, a choice that made his book enormously readable, and as a direct consequence, enormously influential for generations of readers who first encountered these episodes entirely through his account, and never once sought out the original Dutch or English sources sitting underneath it. Modern historians, working carefully back through contemporary court records and detailed price data that Mackay himself apparently never bothered to consult very closely at the time, have since found that he exaggerated several of his most famous and most frequently repeated stories. The scale of tulip mania's supposed social ruin, prominent among them, sometimes rather considerably so. The irony sits uncomfortably close to the book's own central argument. A volume written specifically to warn readers how easily a crowd gets swept up in a story that feels true, without ever being carefully checked, was itself, in more than one of its liveliest chapters, a little too eager to hand its own readers a better story than the surviving sources actually supported, then, and in truth, now as well. The book that taught generations of readers to distrust a crowd's easy certainty turned out in more than one of its most quoted chapters to deserve a measure of that very same distrust itself. On the worst trading days of the crash in October of 1929, so many shares changed hands so quickly that the ticker tape, a machine built to report each trade within a minute or two of it happening, fell hours behind the actual prices being called out on the exchange floor. Investors reading the tape that afternoon were, in effect, watching yesterday's panic scroll past, while an even worse one was already unfolding in real time just a few floors above them. Exchange staff reportedly worked through the following weekend simply to finish processing paperwork from trades that had already happened days earlier, a backlog that took nearly a week to fully clear. The mismatch made an already frightening collapse feel considerably less controllable than it might otherwise have, since a broker relaying a customer's sell order had no reliable way of knowing what price that order would actually execute at until well after the fact, sometimes several hours after the order had first been placed. Rumors filled the gap the delayed tape left behind, some of them wildly exaggerated, feeding a panic that was already severe enough without any exaggeration at all. Exchange officials tried running the ticker mechanism at higher speeds and eventually kept the exchange itself open later into the evening, simply to let the paper catch up with a trading day that had, technically, already ended hours before. What followed in the weeks and months afterward was not confined to Wall Street. Banks failed by the thousands over the next several years, credit dried up across the entire economy, and unemployment climbed toward levels the country had never experienced before, consequences that had far more to do with the country's fragile banking structure than with any single mechanical failure on the exchange floor itself. A machine simply built to report trades quickly enough could not, on the one day that mattered most, keep pace with a panic that had, for once, entirely outrun its own reporting of itself. In 1934, the United States created a federal agency, the Securities and Exchange Commission, whose entire founding purpose was to require companies selling shares to the public to disclose honest, standardized financial information before anyone could legally buy or sell those shares on an American exchange. Its first chairman, appointed by President Franklin Roosevelt, was Joseph Kennedy, a man who had made a considerable part of his own fortune trading in the very markets he was now being asked to police. Roosevelt's choice struck many observers at the time as a strange and even reckless one, and Kennedy himself reportedly joked openly about the apparent contradiction. But the president's underlying reasoning was straightforward enough. A man who had personally used nearly every questionable trading practice the new law now aimed to outlaw understood exactly which loopholes needed closing first, in a way a career regulator with no real trading experience of his own simply could not have. Kennedy served only about a year and a half before moving on to other government posts, a tenure widely regarded even by critics as more effective than his controversial appointment had initially suggested it would be. Kennedy's brief tenure focused less on prosecuting past misconduct than on building the basic disclosure machinery, standardized filings, audited financial statements, clear rules about what companies had to tell investors that the market had never been required to provide before. The underlying idea was narrower than it is sometimes remembered as being today. The new agency was not built on any claim that markets themselves were inherently dangerous or needed to be restrained from operating freely. It rested instead on a simpler, more modest premise that a market can only price anything sensibly at all if the information feeding it is honest, and that honesty, left entirely to develop on its own, simply had not been arriving reliably enough. The agency built to police the market's honesty was, fittingly enough, first run by a man who understood every way that honesty had previously been avoided. In 1933, in the depths of the depression that followed the 1929 crash, Congress passed a law forcing American banks to choose between two separate lines of business: taking ordinary deposits from everyday customers, or underwriting and trading stocks and bonds, but never both activities under a single roof at the same time. The law is named for its two congressional sponsors, Senator Carter Glass of Virginia and Representative Henry Stegall of Alabama, and grew directly out of a widely shared public belief, reinforced by lengthy congressional hearings that exposed some genuinely reckless banking practices from the preceding decade in considerable detail, that banks gambling with depositors' savings and speculative securities had materially contributed to the scale of the crash and the wave of bank failures that followed it. Separating ordinary commercial banking from investment banking was meant to protect everyday depositors from exactly that kind of compounding risk, insulating the boring but essential business of simply holding people's savings from the far riskier, more volatile business of underwriting brand new securities and trading them actively for profit. The same broader legislative package also created federal deposit insurance around the same period, giving ordinary depositors a second, entirely independent layer of protection beyond the structural separation itself, one that outlasted the separation by decades. The wall the law built stood for over 6 decades before it was substantially dismantled by later legislation in 1999, by which point many of the largest financial institutions had already found other lawful ways to blur the line the original law had drawn so firmly. Whether its eventual removal helped cause the financial crisis that arrived less than a decade later remains one of the most contested arguments in modern financial history. A single Depression-era law shaped the basic architecture of American banking for far longer than most of the bankers who spent their careers quietly complying with it ever actually expected it to last. On October the 19th, 1987, a day now remembered simply as Black Monday, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell more than 22% in a single trading session, the sharpest one-day percentage decline in the index's entire history, easily surpassing even the worst single days of the 1929 crash. No single piece of news that particular morning was ever found that could fully explain a drop of that size. Trading volume that day was so heavy that some exchange computer systems reportedly struggled simply to keep up with order flow, compounding the very panic the automated selling programs were already accelerating on their own. Much of the selling accelerated because of computerized trading programs designed by large institutional investors to automatically sell stock once prices fell past certain preset thresholds, a strategy generally called portfolio insurance at the time. As prices dropped and triggered one round of automatic selling, that selling pushed prices down further, which triggered the next round of programs in turn, a feedback loop that no individual trader had designed and that unfolded far faster than any human decision-maker could realistically follow or interrupt. Markets around the world fell sharply that same week, some by even steeper percentages than New York's own decline. A chain reaction that showed just how tightly linked the world's major exchanges had already quietly become by the late 1980s. Exchanges and regulators spent the following years building in deliberate pauses, known as circuit breakers, designed to halt trading automatically once prices fall past certain limits, specifically to interrupt exactly this kind of self-reinforcing, machine-driven spiral before it can run to its full extent again. The Dow itself recovered its entire loss within roughly 2 years, a relatively swift recovery that surprised a great many observers who had quietly assumed 1987 was only the opening chapter of something considerably worse still to come. A crash caused less by any single piece of bad news than by machines faithfully following their own instructions, all at once, and all in the same direction. In the last years of the 20th century, a wave of young companies built around the still-new internet reached paper valuations on stock markets around the world that briefly exceeded those of long-established manufacturers with real factories, real patents, and decades of steady, demonstrated profit behind them. Even though many of these newer companies had barely any revenue and no clear plan for turning a profit at all. Some companies during this period reportedly saw their share prices jump simply from adding the word internet to their name, with little else about the underlying business actually changing. For a few remarkable years, the promise of a genuinely new kind of business, one built entirely around a technology still reshaping how people worked and shopped and communicated, was often enough on its own to move a young company's share price sharply higher, with the usual patient questions about earnings, cash flow, and even basic business viability quietly set aside by investors eager not to miss what felt like an obvious and historic shift. Some of the era's most enthusiastically funded companies never developed a working business model of any kind at all, while others that seemed comparatively unglamorous or even slightly dull at the time went on, only a handful of years later, to become some of the most valuable companies anywhere in the world. When sentiment eventually reversed, share prices across the sector fell sharply and quickly, and a great many companies that had recently commanded enormous paper valuations disappeared within a year or two, unable to raise further funding on any reasonable terms once investor enthusiasm had cooled. The pattern was, in its broad outline, hardly a new one at all. A market had simply decided for a while that its own ordinary arithmetic no longer fully applied to a genuinely new and unfamiliar kind of idea. A market briefly convinced itself that a good story could substitute entirely for a good balance sheet, and then, just as abruptly, remembered that it could not. In 1936, the English economist John Maynard Keynes coined a phrase for the restless, only partly rational impulse that gets people to invest money at all under conditions of genuine uncertainty, and he called that impulse animal spirits, a term meant to capture something closer to raw nerve or spontaneous optimism than to any careful, weighable calculation. Keynes wrote much of this thinking while himself an active and occasionally reckless investor, having weathered his own considerable losses and recoveries in currency and commodity speculation before ever putting the theory to paper. Keynes argued, in his major work The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, that most real investment decisions rest on a future that is simply far too uncertain to calculate with any real precision, no matter how sophisticated an investor's spreadsheets or forecasts might happen to look on paper at the time. Faced with that genuine uncertainty, people invest anyway, driven less by a confident mathematical expectation of the outcome than by a kind of active, spontaneous confidence that Keynes considered a basic and permanent feature of human psychology, rather than a curable flaw investors might one day outgrow with better information or training. Remove that restless confidence from the picture entirely, he suggested, and investment of any real kind would slow to a bare trickle, no matter how favorable the underlying arithmetic happened to look on paper to a perfectly careful observer. Every single market this hour has moved through, from the counting house in Amsterdam weighing a company's uncertain future against a handful of guilders, the crowd pressed into a narrow Paris street, the ticker falling helplessly behind a crash it could not keep pace with, ran ultimately on some version of exactly this. People acting on a feeling about tomorrow, then dressing that feeling up afterward once the outcome was already known, as though it had been a calculation all along. The spreadsheets in every one of these stories came later. The nerve, as it turns out, was always there first. Somewhere, a ledger is still open on a desk that nobody living remembers building. A clerk closes it for the night, the way clerks always have, without any particular sense that the piece of paper in front of him is anything more than paper, or that anyone will ever think to ask about it again. The Dutch carpenter's tulip bulb is long gone, along with the house he traded for it, and the exact tavern where the deal was struck was never marked with anything more permanent than a name in a court record somewhere in Amsterdam. What survived him was not the bulb. It was the habit underneath it. The willingness of one stranger to trust another stranger's signature on a piece of paper, long enough for both of them to walk away and let someone else, much later, decide whether that trust had actually been worth extending. That habit built itself a coffee house, then a tree, then a rulebook, then a room with a floor and a bell, over and over again, in cities that had never once heard of each other's private arrangements or borrowed a single idea from one another on purpose. Nobody planned the whole of it in advance, the way an architect plans a building. And nobody alive today could have sat down and designed it fresh from nothing in one sitting. It simply kept getting rebuilt, quietly, city by city and generation by generation, by ordinary people who mostly just wanted a slightly safer way to place a bet on tomorrow than the one their own parents had been forced to make do with. It is still being built, quietly, this very evening, somewhere neither of us happens to be standing right now, by someone who has never once heard the word bourse. The lights go down over the counting house. The ledger stays open until morning.